This is my Father's world. He shines in all that's there. In the rustling grass, I hear him as he speaks to me everywhere. This is my Father's world. Oh, let me ne'er forget that the wrong things are so strong. It is not the ruler yet. This is my Father's world. The battle is but one. Jesus and I shall be satisfied. Earth and be one. Well, good evening, beloved. I'm grateful for your presence, grateful that you are here. You know, one thing that I like about setting my alarm on my phone is because it rouses me to sleep. It jars me to sleep, or jars me awake. Clearly, I need some more sleep. It jars me awake. It allows me to remember my dreams. You know, how many of us dream? Well, I can tell you, if you're normal, which is hard to define what normal is, but they say that if your brain is functioning as it should, and even in some cases, if it's not functioning as it should, you dream. Whether or not you remember those dreams, that's a different story. And so there's a lot of studies out, and you can find a lot of hogwash, a lot of just pure garbage, mysticism about dreams meaning something. And yes, our dreams can tell us things that we're afraid of, stresses that we're going under, desires. But beyond that, the majority of the time, our dreams are pretty random. They are insignificant. And so there's a lot of studies going on about dream content and psychology. And so when we think about dreams that we have, we need to remember that there is no special quality to our dreams. They don't mean anything. We should not give our dreams any power. But when we come to the Bible, we have specific dreams. And this is going to be a two-part series, unless I decide to change it midway through. But we're going to look at two dreams this evening, see what the dream is and its significance in that person's life, but also what bigger picture, what application does it have for us, and why was it recorded? Instead of it just telling us that he had a dream and they did this or they did that. There's power in understanding the dreams of the Bible. And so I want us to go first to the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 37. Joseph and his dream of greatness. You know, my wife and I heard a very powerful sermon on Joseph and the power of reconciliation. And I hope to kind of get some ideas from that and bring something very similar here in the near future, because I believe it's warranted. I believe if a sermon is worth preaching once, it's worth preaching again. And so Joseph has a dream that honestly reveals God's providence. Because God is going to show Joseph a destination. God is not going to show Joseph what he has to go through in order to get there. So Joseph was a kid who was caught between two different worlds. Being the favorite, and I know what it's like being the favorite, you know. I'm the favorite out of my family. My parents, I think they enjoy me, at least my mom enjoys me more than my brother and my sister. But that's because I'm better looking and I'm just a better kid. But Joseph is caught between being, yes, a favorite, because he was given in the older age of, we see this, that in Genesis 30 and verses 22 through 24, it tells us that Joseph was Rachel's son. And it says in Genesis 37 and verse 3, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children." Well, why? Because he was the son of his old age. Joseph was an answer to a prayer. And so his brothers knew that his parents, specifically their father, loved Joseph more. And that could and does create animosity. And they hated him for it. But Joseph has two dreams. The first dream is recorded for us in Genesis 37, verses 6 through 7. He has the dream, and so he comes to his brothers, and he tells them. So he said to them, "Please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field, and then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright, and indeed your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf." So we have these bundles of wheat, of something that they have collected, and his is the one in the middle, and all of their bundles are bowing down to Joseph's bundle. Okay, that's the first dream. And it tells us in verse 8 that, they were, should you reign over us? Are you going to be king over us? Do you think you're more special than us? Then in verse 9, then he dreamed still another dream and told it to his brothers. Now, you got to think, what is prompting Joseph to tell his brothers about this second dream? Especially after the way that they treated him. We could make some hypothesis. We could go back and forth and we could say, well, maybe something in the dream is just compelling him. Maybe something inside of him is compelling him. You need to tell your brothers. Or maybe Joseph is not the person that he needs to be. Oftentimes, when you are the favorite, you are babied longer, and you don't become the one that you need to become until you go through some hard times. That could possibly be it. Joseph is not who he needs to be, but he will become the one that he needs to become. And so he tells his brothers, hey, I have another dream. And he says, and this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bow down to me. So he told it to his father and his brother, and this time his father got involved in rebuking him. What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I, your brothers, indeed come to and bow down to the earth before you? And verse 11, and his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. His father made a mistake. His father knew the promise. His father knew that Joseph was special because he was blessed in his old age. But maybe he's slacking. Maybe he is not forgetful, but maybe he doesn't want to cause his other children any more undue pain. But what does this dream mean? Well, these two dreams, they revealed something about Joseph's future that Joseph could not have completely understood at the time. He would eventually occupy the position of authority, and his brothers would come before him. But notice something. The dreams did not tell him how he would get there. God revealed a destination, but God did not reveal the journey that Joseph had to go through in order to become the person that he needed. These dreams did not prevent his trials. We sang a song, I believe it was this morning, about the providence of God. Joseph and his entire story is an amazing illustration about the providence of God. He just happened to be thrown into a dry pit. Have you ever noticed that little detail that is there in your Bible? It's a dry pit. It's a pit that he could stay in and not drown. It's a pit that he could stay in and remain healthy for some time. It's a dry pit. He was sold not once, but twice. Imagine what that does to a person's psyche. First, you're sold by your brethren, your own flesh and blood, and then you're sold again to a bunch of Egyptians. Have you ever wondered if while his brothers were discussing what they're going to do with him, if he overheard them saying, well, killing him would not be good. We need to sell him. What that would do, again, to a person's psyche. What about the incident with Potiphar and his wife? What about being thrown into jail? You think Joseph forgot about these dreams through all these trials, through all these difficulties? You see, these dreams, again, showed the destination, but they did not show him what he had to go through in order to become this man that people would bow down before. Maybe he had to earn it. Maybe he had to become a person worthy of honor than some spoiled, rotten, snot-nosed kid. And so these dreams, after some time, they come true. We can jump ahead a few chapters all the way to Genesis 41 and verse 41. In Genesis 41 and verse 41, it says, "And Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt.'" Now, a dream that we will not cover is the dream that Joseph interpreted for Pharaoh about the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. Well, Joseph was able to convince the Pharaoh and help him, and so he has gotten himself into the position of authority. They had the 7 years of plenty. They built stock. They built storage houses. They had an overabundance, and so they were preparing for this 7 years of famine. Well, just a little while later, this famine hits. In Genesis 42 and verse 6, it says this, "Now Joseph was governor over the land, and it was he who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brother came and bowed down before him with their faces to the earth. Joseph recognizes them. They do not recognize him. He's older. He's probably put on some weight. He probably has the attire of the Egyptian. He probably has even some makeup that the Egyptians would often wear. And so the famine has hit, and his brothers have come to seek assistance, to seek food. And we have this in Genesis 42 and 6, and even again in Genesis 43 and verse 26. We see that all of Egypt is bowing down before Joseph. I wonder if that's the stars and the suns and all the heavenly hosts bowing down before Joseph, if maybe that is us understanding that the entire world is coming together and bowing down. I wonder. But we see that sometimes with God's providence, we don't see it until after the fact, and we look back. Consider the words of Joseph in Genesis 45, beginning in verse 5. He says, "But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves, because you sold me." So Joseph has clearly come out to his brothers, saying, I am your brother. He says, "Do not be angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." How much has he had to grow as a person to see that God was working behind the scenes, working and even God using his brothers who had an evil intent within themselves. God was allowing them to go through with this so that something good would happen. He goes on to say that you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. We see this in verses 7 through 8. It says, "And God sent me before you to preserve a prosperity for you in the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God, and he has made me a father to Pharaoh and Lord of all his house and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt." Again, how many times does Joseph in this very short section of text refer to God as the one who sent me? God is the one who worked this out, and I understand the purpose. I understand that I was sent so that I could not just save my family, but I could save a good chunk of the known world that is in this area, because everyone came to Egypt. And so what does this teach us about God's providence? We look at the dream of Joseph and we see his journey into the pit, into the jail cell, into some emotional depths, to the point that Joseph, and we'll look at this, breaks down and he falls on his face and he kisses his brothers. Joseph had to learn and grow, and sometimes God's providence helps to shape us to become the person that we need to be. And when we look back and we can understand, wow, it was God's handiwork through it all. Because I'm not the person who I am today without the providence of God in my life. And I can look back and I can see the providence of God. Melody, for example, is an aspect of the providence of God. That day that she walked into our geology class, something just clicked. We became friends. And I'm a better man for it. And I'm thankful that she walked into that classroom. While everyone else was uncomfortable in the hallway, I'm there in the classroom with my feet kicked up, relaxing. She walks in and says, well, I guess we're the only smart ones here. Going, I guess so. Everyone else is outside. The two of us, we're comfortable in chairs. The providence of God. You know, the providence of God can be working behind the scenes, and we can be just unaware. A difficult circumstance does not mean that God has abandoned you. You think that maybe passed through Joseph's mind? Thrown into the pit, sold not once but twice, overhearing his brothers quite possibly, there's no benefit in killing him. Let's sell him. We don't want the blood on his blood on our hands. Being thrown down into the prison, and then being treated better by a bunch of strangers than your own family. Have you ever considered that? How loved he was by the Egyptian people? Joseph's pit was not the end, but truly the beginning of who he needed to become. Something happened to him in that pit. Something happened to him in that jail cell. He became the man that he needed to become. It took years. It woke him up. Potiphar's wife was just the first of many trials that he was going to have to face. Because it would have been easier. It would have been more enjoyable just to give in. But Joseph says, how can I do this great sin? How can I sin against God? That's powerful. Why did God elevate Joseph? In hopes that he would do right to save many. We see this in Genesis 50. Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20. Again, we've seen those two verses that speak about that God preserved him so that he would save those lives. Here's the verse I was thinking of in verse 20. But as for you, you meant it evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. There's some interesting reports. There's some interesting documentation about how many lives were truly saved during this time. And what is so interesting is there's many good brethren who are scientists, who are archaeologists, who they can pinpoint when this happened and how the entire world came to Egypt to get fed. It's very neat. It's very interesting. So please know that just because your world may be crashing down around you, it doesn't mean that you're defeated. It doesn't mean that you are abandoned. A verse that is often taken out of context is Romans 8 and verse 28. Know that all things work together for good for those who love the Lord. It means that we need to trust the process. That we need to have faith and confidence in God. That the providence of God is still working today. It's here with us this evening. We all have a destination. But the road that it takes for us to get there, we all have to travel it. Each of us will have to travel our own road with God. The second dream I want to consider this evening is Nebuchadnezzar's dream. We're going to jump quite a few years. Now, this dream is going to show us the sovereignty of God. Nebuchadnezzar had this troubling dream, and he basically puts his wise men, tell us this dream. Tell me what this dream means. And his wise men say, well, you first need to tell us what it means. And he goes, no, that's not how it works. Well, we can't tell you what it means until you tell us what it is. And so Nebuchadnezzar is wising up, and he goes, you know what? You guys are a bunch of fakes. And so he begins slaughtering them. And he kills those that are in the immediate vicinity, and then he begins to just kind of go at it and kill all the wise men, all the scholars and scientists that are throughout his land. And Daniel hears what's going on, and he goes, well, you know what? What's going on? I can interpret this dream. Because we see there in chapter 2 and verse 10 that human wisdom failed. And so what does Daniel do? Does Daniel try to make up a story or anything? No. Daniel seeks after God. Chapter 2, verses 17 through 18 of Daniel. Look at what it says here. Then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they might seek mercies from God of heaven concerning this secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision, so Daniel blessed God of heaven. Daniel goes to God, him and his companions. Daniel receives what the dream is and what it means, and he blesses God. The dream is revealed to him in verse 19. And did you notice that Daniel had a dependence on God? He showed gratitude toward God. He gives glory to God. And so the dream is revealed to us as a reader in verse 32. And it's from 32 and on. And what is interesting is this dream, of course, is the statue. And it's made up of different components, different stones. In verse 38, he says, "Thou art the head of gold." Okay. The silver represents the second kingdom. The brass represented the third kingdom. And the fourth represented the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, but it's also going to be mingled with clay. We see that in verses 41 through 43. Speaking about the Roman Empire being strong but weak. And we understand why it was strong, but we also understand why it was weak. It had internal turmoil. It had internal weaknesses. And so it led to Rome's ultimate downfall. But what is interesting here in verse 44 is it speaks about a stone not cut with hands. In verse 44, it says this: "And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left. To other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forevermore." You know, we think about history, and we think about biblical history. You have Babylonians. Then you have the Persians. Then you have the Greeks, Alexander the Great, and then you have Rome. And this stone that is not cut with hands is going to rise in that fourth kingdom during those days. You know, the meaning of this dream means that man's kingdoms are temporary. No matter how mighty they are, no matter how big they are, every single one of these kingdoms thought they were the biggest dog on the block. And at the time they were, at least on the earthly side. No one could go up against Babylon until the Persians came through. No one could go up against the Persians until God raised up the Greeks and Alexander the Great. And so it's interesting to note that God has more power than anyone could ever dream of. Let's go back to verse 21. of Daniel chapter 2. He says, He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. He goes on, he says, I thank you and praise you, O God of my father. You have given me wisdom and might. You have now made known to me what we ask of you, for you have made known to us the king's demand. God works in the kingdoms of men. We're going to see that come up in Daniel chapter 4 and verse 32. But notice when this kingdom would be established. This is there in verse 44. And in the days of these kings, the kingdom, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom. Notice when it will be established, during the last days, or during the days of this fourth kingdom, the Roman Empire. But also notice who establishes it. It's God. It would never be destroyed. It would not be replaced by another earthly kingdom. I find that fascinating, and I find that comforting. And this prophecy of the church was established, and we find it basically spoken of in Luke chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, how Jesus was born, or Jesus came to be during the days of the Roman Empire. John began to preach something later. In Matthew chapter 3 and verse 2, he says, Repent, for the kingdom is at hand. The kingdom is coming. The kingdom of God is being fulfilled. Mark 1, in verse 15. In Matthew 16, verses 18 through 19, Jesus Christ said, I will build my church. I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. When we think about the church and what it means and how powerful God's kingdom is, Colossians 1 and verse 13 tells us He has delivered us from the power of darkness and conveyed us, the King James Version says, translated us into the kingdom of His Son, the kingdom of the Son of His love, in whom we have redemption through His blood, the forgiveness of sins. The kingdom of God, the kingdom that Christ established, it's here, and it's not going anywhere. It is strong, it is powerful. Hebrews 12 and verse 28 says, Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. Sometimes we think that we can slack off just because we know the church isn't going anywhere. Well, the church may not go anywhere, but a congregation can die out. And we must not allow ourselves to die out. That is not acceptable. That is why we need to do our part. But His church continues to this day and will continue forever. Matthew 16 and verse 18. So what can we learn from this dream? Well, it's really interesting when you go through and you see how each of these kingdoms added to something of the world that ultimately helped spread the gospel. Whether it was the letter system, whether it was the roads, whether it was different types of humanitarian laws and that kind of stuff. But one thing that we need to learn is that we do not need to put eternal confidence in temporary things. Psalm 146. Consider what Psalm 146 and verse 3 says. Because too many times do we put confidence in man. We put confidence in kings. We put confidence in even our own government. But consider what 146 and verse 3 says. Do not put your trust in princes, nor in a son of man in whom there is no help. We do not need to put our confidence in man. We do not need to lay up treasures here on earth where moth and rust and thieves can break in, Matthew 6 and verse 19. Governments will always come and go. If God permits us to be here long enough, we may one day see the collapse of America, and a new government will rise from its ashes. We may live long enough for that to happen. We may see that collapse. Every nation eventually collapses, but the nation of God will never. God remains the same. And so if we're going to dream, let us dream big. If we're going to dream, let us dream about saving souls, strengthening families, and being an active part of this amazing kingdom. You know, this first set of dreams revealed just how God operates and some fundamental truths. The second set of dreams that we're going to be looking at will show how we are to conduct ourselves, how we are to allow it to change us, the things that we see, the things that we go through in our response to God. Joseph's dreams never failed him. Though he failed to understand the road that God was placing him on, the road that he had to take, his dreams still came true. May I recommend that we don't judge God working in us by one chapter of our lives. You see, too many times we come into contact with difficulties, and we'll go through a period of life filled with just downright difficulties, and nothing seems to be going right. And we judge God based upon that one chapter. We forget what has happened beforehand, and we completely give up hope of what comes next. So don't judge God by one chapter of your life. May I also recommend that we don't build our lives and make it into an idol of what God has already said will pass away. This world is not our home. I thank God for that. I don't want to be here forever. And here's where it gets personal. There may be things happening in your life today that you just don't understand. Trust God's providence. There may be things happening in the world that you just don't see. Where is God? How could God be allowing things like this to happen? Trust in God's sovereignty. There may be things and there may be times that God, His promises seem so far away. Remember Joseph. Remember his time in the pit, his time in the jail. There may be times when earthly powers seem to be overwhelming and God seems so distant. Remember Nebuchadnezzar. Do you understand that that dream revealed that Nebuchadnezzar would be taken out? That his precious kingdom that he thought would stand the test of time, it's nothing special. The kingdoms of men are not special when it comes to being compared to God. We don't stand a chance against God. The God who was working in Joseph's life, in Daniel's life, is the God who is ruling in the kingdoms of men. He's the one who is working in each and every one of our lives providentially. We just have to have the courage, the wisdom, and the patience to see it, to look for it, to jump when an opportunity presents itself, and to make the very best of our lives. Maybe something has been said this evening that you are still curious about. Maybe you don't know if you are a Christian and you have questions about the lesson, or you have questions about what it means to become a child of God. If you're watching online or you're here in this room, we would love to sit down with you and study with you. And so you book chapter and verse what is required of any person to become a child of God. But maybe you are a child of God. Maybe you have put Christ on in baptism, but you've allowed this world to just get in the way. Maybe you are like Joseph, stuck in that pit. Maybe you hear the closest ones to you talking about betraying you and killing you and selling you. And you go through all these different trials. Maybe you're like King Nebuchadnezzar. You think you had everything in your life planned out. And then someone tells you it's all about to change. That your hopes and your aspirations and your dreams, they don't matter much. And our dreams and our aspirations, they don't matter much if God is absent. If anyone has any need this evening, please come forward as we stand united and as we sing.
Like Jesus waiting, waiting.